Kit, I will be managing this webinar seminar, and I will be handing over immediately to our Chair of Council, Ambassador Nozibo January Bardale, to do the welcoming remarks. Chair, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andre, and for organizing this seminar today. And a very, very warm welcome and good afternoon to every single one of you on this call. There are now 55 people, if those numbers are correct, which I believe they are. And also to say this welcome is being done on behalf of all council members, on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor and her senior management team, our students, as well as our academic and administrative staff, our workers and our unions who also sit on council as members, and really my sincerest appreciation for voluntarily choosing to spend 2 hours with us this afternoon, and at a time when all of our attention is focused on the national agenda as our political parties that many of you will have voted for on the 29th of May, use their collective wisdom to land us and all of our people of South Africa at a stable constitutional state that will serve the needs of all our people. I'm an optimist by nature, and I believe passionately in the resilience of the people of Mzansi. And so I'm sure that something very positive will come out of this. So I want to extend a special thanks to all my colleagues who agreed to speak on the panels that Professor Keert and the VC have assigned to them. I know how diligent council members are, and in this regard, I'd like to just say a few words about the council so that you know where the origins of this seminar come from. I know that the members this afternoon will be prepared and will give you nothing less than the high standards that they always set themselves. Professor Ahmed, I'm not sure if you're on the call yet, but you are a friend of NMU, and all the experience in the sector that you will share with us this afternoon will, I'm sure, also be most valuable. Ladies and gentlemen, this series will not have been started with a different council at the helm of our institution. I have the privilege of having chaired the Council of NMU since 2018 and have served on the NMU Council, not as a chairperson, since 2015. And before that, in 2015, this was before we removed the second M in our name, the Metropolitan. I also did a 4-year stint on the Council of UCT in the mid-1990s, when Professor Mampele Rampela was the Vice-Chancellor at UCT, and where I gathered some experience about corporate governance in a university setting. Otherwise, I've sat on the boards of several companies and still on the board of 3 NGOs, 2 in South Africa, 1 in Ghana, 1 trust at the UN in Geneva, and the MTN Foundation here in South Africa. The last 8 years have been tough but most fulfilling. They have confirmed for me that councils, like many boards, are as effective as the persons, the men and the women who sit and work on them. My colleagues are some of the most professional volunteers and professionals that I have had the privilege of leading the university with. They've given this university selfless dedication and the best of ethical leadership. We have not governed the institution like the all-male and all-white Steinhoff, to cite an extreme example of a very dicey governance situation where the culture of command and control of everyone was the dominant and destructive modus operandus. Our corporate governance was guided by principles that are embedded in our constitution and in the values of our institution and our icon, Dr. Mandela. Our diverse membership enabled us to co-create a conducive and ethical culture that set high standards of performance for council and the executives of the university. We were inspired by the values of the university, but also the Vice-Chancellor's inaugural speech. And in that regard, we've promoted transparency and a level of openness where every member can express their views and opinions without fear of looking stupid or feeling stupid or creating favor and patronage. Dissenting voices were welcomed and well managed. We try to understand our social, political, economic, and physical environment in all its complexity and learn that our analytical skills must be developed further to deepen our understanding of the existential realities of our country, our continent, and the world at large, so that we can better lead the university into the future. We do think global and act local as we take on the challenge of changing the world. We embraced our values and stewardship through a feminist lens of inclusiveness, collaboration, and honest communication, engagement, and accountability. In this regard, we have sometimes had to grapple with the conservatism and bureaucratic formal procedures and protocols of universities and unconsciously stifle the ideals that we strive for. We have actively avoided adopting double standards, and we know that we exercise our corporate governance only when disaster looms. And if that happened, it would be too late, and we might find ourselves in yellow overalls that our families and grandchildren would be very devastated by. So this seminar will thus be the beginning of several others that will enrich our collective commitment and understanding of the political economy that the university has to navigate. It is happening at a seminal moment, as I alluded to earlier, when we have to don all our thinking caps and to open all our hearts to continue and build on the strength of our country and our people and the university and contribute to our development through transformative and innovative learning and teaching, research, and engagement. Colleagues, those are the opening remarks that I thought I should make, just so that you see our council also in context. The university has chosen to structure the seminar in the following way. We will have 2 panels of 3 members each, and you will have 10 to 12 minutes to make an input. Each panel will be followed by a Q&A and comments in the chat room. I'm sure that you have all read the concept blurb that Andre sent to you. While we suggest the following guidelines, please feel free to improvise and give it your own reading and your own pathways. Political economy refers to the relationship between the state, society, political ideology, the economy, and markets at global, regional, and national levels. Within this framework, various forces come into play, such as racial capitalism, globalization, neoliberal ideologies, and market fundamentalism, to name just a few examples. These forces not only affect the funding of higher education, but also shape the evolving role of universities as our complex futures unfold. There are a few other forces, economic, cultural, political, environmental, and technological, that we can consider and integrate into our thinking processes. Please take the liberty to focus on your own choices and directives. What are the possible futures for university sustainability and funding for the post-school and education and training sector in general, and given the trends in global and local politics and economy and social cultural developments? Secondly, in general, there is patchy articulation between university outcomes and the world of work. In addition, the community-university society nexus could be much stronger, more equalizing and more consistent, and the purpose of the university as a force of good remains improperly articulated and largely aspirational. Please deliberate on how to address that question. Number 3, the university's mission of teaching, research, and engagement are in constant interplay with questions of transformation, institutional culture, and other higher education challenges. The university ecosystem consists of various stakeholders. Consider how the university should balance these different interests while advancing its academic reputation, sustainability, and social legitimacy. Fourth, compared with other systems, the South African university sector has enjoyed relative space for working with the massive complexities and contradictions of our system and its institutions. Going forward, universities and the post-school sector in general must lead efforts to align an ever-growing range of expectations and rethink a social contract of sorts to balance academic freedom and public accountability. How can we advance this? Number 5, we locate the university as embedded and thus reflective of a broader polity and society. Yet the role of the university as a critique and conscious of society requires a certain type of organization and understanding that places it in a position to perform this role as best as it can. What types of understanding of the university make it better at becoming a critique and conscious of society? And lastly, colleagues, the distance between public and private higher education in South Africa is strange and worrying, and I think most of you know about this. How should we think the interface between public and private institutions within corporate models, within cooperative models that prioritize the general transformation principles of the white paper number 3? So those are the frameworks. Those are the, if you like, stimulant questions that we have asked. But as I said earlier, you have the freedom and the choice is really yours as to where you'd like to take this conversation. So I will say thank you for your attention, and I will pass you back to Andre, our program director, and our Zoom coordinator, Professor Jenny Duplessis, to facilitate this conversation. Thank you very much, Andre.
Thank you so much, Chair, for those wonderful remarks and introduction. Colleagues, we have circulated the blurb around the idea of a council seminar series, which actually emerged at the, through the various discussions that council engage within its council meetings, and of course a desire, from council, given the fact that it is keenly aware that its governance, tasks intersect with the bigger questions of society. And on that basis, of course, argued for this particular webinar series to then take off. So we're very happy, for you to have joined this first webinar, which deal with the political economy of South African higher education, as so beautifully located by the chairperson. So we will be having 2 panels, and I hope that the panelists can, manage the time. Each one of them will have 10 minutes to make an input. And you, of course, are encouraged as participants to put your comments and ideas, your suggestions and questions in the chat box. We will moderate that, we will curate that and feed that back, so that after the first, first panel, the first 3 members, of course, we will then ask them to respond to those. So we have for the first panel, and we've also shared very extensive biographies of the 6 panelists with you. So I'm not going to read those. All our council member and panelists are people of high repute with expertise in various fields and a particular connection into higher education. So the first panel would be Mr. Joe Samuels, then Dr. Nolita Vukuza, and then Prof. Nomalanga Mkhize. So let us kick off, colleagues. Please enjoy yourselves. Let us kick off then with inviting Mr. Joe Samuel to take the floor and make the input presentation for 10 minutes. Joe, it's over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andre. If I can just ask you to help me, if I get close to 10 minutes, to just show your face, then I shall know that I need to that I need to wrap up. Thank you very much, Chair and Vice Chancellor and Council members and the rest of the audience. I thought what I'll do is reflect on the 5th area that the Chair had outlined, and that is to do a little bit of reflection on this idea of the university as a conscience and as a critic of society. However, the point that I want to make is that, before one actually goes into what are the kind of organization and practices and so on that universities should have, one of the key things would be to be reflective on practices of the university, in the broader sectoral context. So, and I'm doing that reflection in the light of the fact that South Africa is facing a critical challenge, in the sense that it is seen as one of the most unequal societies in the world. So the paper then tries to examine the financial landscape of South African universities. It analyzes the Council on Higher Education, the CHE report on executive remuneration, and proposes urgent solutions to promote equity and transparency. Now, if one looks at the financial landscape of South African universities, then, there are three things that kind of stands out. Firstly, that we have over the years a dwindling government subsidies, and that this historically significant source of income have been decreasing over time, or in some cases just a little bit of an increase, but not keeping trend, with the actual expenditure and so on. The second source of funding is that of student fees. Now, while the student fees, is becoming a major source of income, their increases have been limited by the kind of social compact agreements and concerns about access. So in addition to that, we've also seen that, there's been rising student debt that further makes the financial situation and burden on students and institutions. And then thirdly, there's the idea of resource mobilization, or what is called the third stream. And given the economic situation, it is very uncertain and it's very competitive, as it were. Now, if we take that seriously, then, so there isn't much scope of getting funding in terms of those three streams. The other way is to then look at what are the ways in which one can reduce expenditure, as it were. So that, and I think, the VC, in fact, called the last budget, a kind of defensive budget, but it's quite important that one needs to know that one needs to expand that as well. However, what I want to reflect on now is, the university finds itself in a broader political economy and a broader sector of universities. And so the CHE report that served at the portfolio committee raised a number of very interesting and, of course, disturbing issues. For example, the CHE report reveals a number of disturbing trends in executive remuneration. The report argues that there's opaque decision-making processes and that remuneration committees often benchmark against higher-paying institutions, leading to inflated salaries. They also, show that international benchmarking further drives up compensation without considering the local context. And of course, we know there is a worldwide battle for talent. They also point out the lack of transparency and oversight. So small groups with limited disclosure often make decisions about executive pay. The absence of strong regulation results in a wide variation in excessive increases in executive pay. Then there's often a disconnect, they say, between performance and the pay. So high remuneration often lacks correlation with individual or institutional performance, raising questions about the justification for such high salaries. Now, what is the consequences of the current system? There's growing inequality. So the current system increases inequality within universities, widen the gap between executives and other staff, It also erodes public trust. The perception of excessive and unjustified executive pay damages public trust and raises questions about the commitment of universities to equity. Now, what are the proposed solutions that the CHE is putting forward? They argue that there should be ministerial guidelines. The CHE report recommends developing clear ministerial guidelines to standardize executive pay and also ensure transparency. Now, I'm not too sure, whether that is going to, be what the Government of National Unity is going to, or whoever the minister is going to be, is going to focus on, but that is certainly one of the proposals. They also argue for enhanced transparency, that universities must publish detailed reports on executive remuneration, including the criteria and the justification for decisions that they've made. They argue for regular audits and for public disclosures, which they say are essential. The third one is strengthening governance, and this is where I think it's quite critical, for councils, at our university and across the sector. That largely, people have been, or we councils have been blamed for this, making these kind of decisions. Then they also argue for performance-based pay, so we establish robust mechanisms to link executive pay to measurable performance indicators is essential to ensure that the remuneration reflects actual contributions to institutional goals. And in fact, if the goals are not being met, then what is quite important then is to, then make sure that there isn't any increases. Now, Andre has just shown me that my time is nearly up. So there are obviously broader inequality. The broader context is that these kinds of very high gaps in, has got a key role, or in fact, if one talks about inequality and ethical concerns, I'm not going to go into that. I also want to say that the Nelson Mandela University has got a very good institutional transformation plan that for 2023 to 2027, and it addresses quite a lot of these issues, as it were, but there isn't a specific issue that deals with executive pay. I mean, there are other components that will certainly help. Now, so what is the immediate action? And here I believe that universities should take the lead. Universities cannot wait for external directives from ministers and elsewhere and others. They must proactively address the executive pay disparities and related issues. So, for example, immediate transparency. They need to voluntarily publish detailed remuneration reports and regular audit executive compensation. They should also strive for stronger governance. So review and strengthen the governance structures to ensure transparent and inclusive decision-making. They should ensure that there's performance-linked pay. There should be fair pay structures. And lastly, I think that council shouldn't just wait for government or for the management of the university. I think council chairpersons should get together and they should organize initiatives to organize seminars, workshops, or conferences to address issues like executive pay so that the sector as a sector can take the lead and address this particular issue. So in conclusion then, the CHE report is a wake-up call for South African universities. Universities can reclaim their ethical leadership and critique society by embracing transparency, strengthening governance, and aligning executive pay with performance and institutional goals. This is not just about financial fairness, it's about fulfilling their mission to create a more just and equitable society. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Joe. Thanks for that, man. Wonderful. Appreciate it, and thanks for sticking to that time so well. Colleagues, let me immediately ask Dr. Lolita Vukuza to present her 10-minute input to us. Lolita, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chair of the proceedings. I must say that there wasn't a better time than now to deliberate on an issue as poignant as this one. So I am excited to be part of friends, colleagues, and the entire NMU family. And a very good afternoon to the Chair of Council, fellow council members, fellow presenters, the Vice Chancellor, your team, and all organs of the university. Chair, as you said, things are moving very fast, the globe over, not least here at home. As such, I have had to change my input so many times. I must say that I got very greedy when I saw the range of suggestions that Professor Kiet made, such that I had to nudge myself to remain calm and focus on one or two issues that have been on my mind regarding this topic. And just the other day, the Institute of Economics and Peace released its 18th edition of the Global Peace Index. And I thought to myself, here is one lens through which one could assess the political economy of the world, the countries and institutions over. What is evident in the report is that the world in which we live is a place without peace. What Hositsile terms the present being a dangerous place to live. Speaking to geopolitical instability, the Peace Index reports that currently there are 56 active conflicts around the world, and these include wars, rebels, governments, militia, you name them. 108 countries have increased their militarization. There are about 110 refugees worldwide, million, that is 110 million. 92 countries are involved in conflicts beyond their borders. Sub-Saharan Africa has suffered the largest deterioration in peacefulness at 134%. And that South Africa ranks as the 127th peaceful country in the world. And I couldn't help but ask the question, what is peace actually? And why is it so elusive? Peace is broadly understood as a sense of harmony and well-being within a society or individual, sometimes referred to as positive peace. Positive peace encompasses the presence of justice, of equity, and the conditions necessary for individuals to thrive. It also pertains to inner peace, which is a state of mental and emotional calmness with no anxiety or stress. Out of a whopping 163 countries and states that were measured, South Africa scored 127th as a country without these elements that constitute peace. Against that framework, I began to ponder about whether higher education South Africa can justifiably say it is a place of positive peace that encompasses the necessary individuals to thrive. Who are the necessary individuals in higher education? Who are the players in shaping the political economy of higher education, I ask? There are invariably many stakeholders in this sector, but my mind now rests on students, as I think they are the missing middle in the discourse of the political economy in higher education. Students are indeed the main stakeholders in the political economy of higher education through their financial contribution, meaning fees, whether these are private, public, or otherwise. They are stakeholders in the political economy through their labor that they offer on campus, be this as tutors or researchers. They are this through political engagement, be this SRC or organs of student leadership, between themselves and faculty, themselves as management, or among themselves. If you notice, Chair, politicians are very fond of students, and most politicians cut their teeth as student leaders. And lastly, students are crucial for the economy of the country. As they enter the workforce, they impact economic activity, innovation, and social progress. If then students are that crucial in the political economy of the sector and the country, why then is it not common to find policies, books, or publications that spend time on the kind of student that South Africa wants to produce? That scarcity alone, in my view, is devoid of peace. There are landmarks in the South African history which show us how unpeaceful the students' world has been and still is. In 1976, which is just 3 days away from commemorating, students protested the apartheid regime as they wanted peace from subjugation. I am also a cohort of 1976, and in that year, I involuntarily wrote my matric in Afrikaans. Was this a peaceful exercise? It was not. In the democratic South Africa of 2015, the Fees Must Fall movement was formed by students who wanted peace from financial exclusion as well as peace from colonial curricula. Every year, there are protests by students who want conditions that are necessary for them to thrive. Speaking of the two landmark protests, some 3 years ago, I watched a television program where there was a panel of former students reflecting on the Fees Must Fall movement of 2015. They were angry at a lot of things. They were angry at the 1976 movement and everything else that followed post-1994. They looked at 2015 and felt sold out by the class of 1976, of which I'm part. They felt misunderstood, forgotten, unnoticed, ignored. They felt let down by those that fought against apartheid. And they felt this group did not show any empathy towards them. Not to mention that they had no mentors like us in the earlier years. Mentors like Steve Biko, Bani Pichana, Mampela Rampele, and many others. They felt that the only way they could express themselves was the way it was done by those students who fought against the apartheid government. They were as angry with the democratic government as we were with the apartheid government. They found no comfort, no protection from the public. They found no protection from the police, the same way we found none with the apartheid police. In other words, the students of these two respective epochs rejected the conditions they were subjected to as they were not conducive for them to thrive in. Of course, we must take issue with how often students express their anger, banning the very resources they will need to create the conditions they want them to thrive in. A paradox, I must say. And this point moves me towards the end, being mindful of time, where I want to pose a few reflective questions. Against these scaffoldings of peace that I have just summarily mapped out, what is peace for today's student, I ask? And how can we satisfy the conditions of peace for the student of today? In the 30 years of democracy, what kind of student has South Africa produced? And what is a South African student's unique proposition? A few months ago, President Thabo Mbeki called for a national dialogue. And there have been calls from the higher education sector on an agenda on higher education, given all the attendant complexities. Scholars like Professor Bani Pichana, who was putting forward the idea of a national indaba on students in higher education. Our very own Professor Ahmed Bawa, here present, also putting on the table the agenda of social justice on higher education. Professor Aaron Rensbeck, who also believed that a form of a dialogue should happen between and amongst institutions and in society, where an intergenerational dialogue, whereby different generations may listen to one another to find common solutions. It is evident, Chair, that the solution of a student and the conditions under which he or she must thrive is not in the classroom. As one commentator said, I quote, "The music is not on the piano." The African culture, which believes that it takes a village to raise a child, it believes that it takes a village to raise a child. And I ask, who is the village for the student we want to see in higher education? The village is a parent who hands over their children to the education institution, realizing that education begins at home. The village is the student who must come to the party armed with the right attitude, the ability to discern, to respect, and willingness to grow and develop. A student who will be, with our guidance, a constructive activist. The village is the university that is available to listen, to empathize, to inspire as it engages the student. The village is the police, private or public, that fully understands how to deal with the student protests. The village is a father to any girl who understands that they cannot be blessers. The village is the workplace that accommodates diversity. And the village is the state that looks after the welfare of its children. So hopefully, Chair, if the village can come to the party of higher education, I want to think that there will be peace at least, and that the political economy of higher education in South Africa shall improve. Let me rest it there, Chair, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Hey, wonderful, Lolita. Thanks so much for that. And of course, your interesting metaphors coming through as well. I hope that will be picked up in the chat box as well. So colleagues, please feel free to make any comment in the chat box and we'll take it further after the third speaker, who is Prof. Mkhize Nomalanga. Nomalanga, can I hand over to you now for your 10-minute input?
Hi, thanks. I'm trying to share. I'm just struggling to find the document I need to share. Show all windows. Okay, found it. Okay. Thanks. This will help me to stick to 10 minutes, Andre.
Okay, sure.
Okay, thanks. Okay,
Oh,
thank you.
Can you make it full screen?
I'll make it bigger, ne, Chair?
Yeah,
Slideshow.
Oh, there's too many things. Once you have Zoom on your screen, you have too many things going on. Okay, there we go. Okay, thank you. I wanted to start with a story that a friend of mine who's a financial journalist wrote. His name is Pagamisa Nzamela. And he wrote an article in 2015. Actually, when we both used to write for the Business Day. And he just this brief article on the history of education funding and the role of Jan Kitchoff. And if we just go into the article a little bit, Nzamela tells the story of how Jan Kitchoff was one of the pioneers in education funding in South Africa, particularly creating part of the creation of what would become NSFAS and also what would become EduLoan. And basically, this is what it says here. More than 2 decades ago, Jan Kitchoff was one of the founding pioneers of education funding in South Africa. He foresaw that the government's education lending scheme was not going to cater for every student in need. And so he basically launched EduLoan. Effectively, what happened here was that Jan Kitchoff foresaw, coming from the banking sector, that even though they had established TEFSA, which was going to cater for poor students, that there was not going to be sufficient funds in the post-apartheid context for sufficient funding for those that are now called the missing middle. So to address the issue of the missing middle, they went into the scheme called EduLoan, which is a privatized education loan company, as most of you know. I wanted to point this thing out because it effectively shows you that the policy mechanism for funding post-apartheid higher education was born out of these bankers. And the post-apartheid government simply copy-pasted what they said. And I think it's very important to name these people and the networks in which they live. I mean, we all know Paul Harris and others who founded First Rand, Ferreira, etc. Now, this is the network out of which the thinking around post-apartheid education formulated its template. I call this blind spots because I'm sure these people were very well intentioned or thought this was a good idea. But could they foresee that in 2015, that missing middle that they thought was going to be catered for through Edulon would start burning their universities because the cost of attending higher education increased substantially over time? And to balance our books, we as universities or higher education institutions began to increase fees by more than the inflation rate. We just look at UCT here. The cost of a BA to basically do history and sociology and anthropology and learn how to think, you're paying 71,000 Rand a year. And that, of course, excludes accommodation. So if I just suck thumb and I sort of think, how much does it cost to live at a bare minimum in Cape Town? You're paying about 220,000 Rand a year for accommodation. And so your Bachelor of Arts in reality costs about 500,000 if you look at all.
Jenny, is that me or Nomalanga?
It's no longer.
Oh, that's sad. Let's give Nomalanga a little time to get reconnected. I'll check with her in the meantime. Sorry, colleagues, for that. So she's trying to get back in, colleagues. So we'll give her a minute or two to get in here as well. But I was wondering, Nolita, if you perhaps can't engage a bit further with regard to the type of student attributes that you think should emerge through the idea of the village that can also generate various kinds of pathways for positive peace through South African university systems. I must say it is for me a novel connection. Can you say something more about that, and how do you think it links up to your opening statement around the university as a place for the production of peace?
Yeah. Can you see me, Prof?
I can hear you. I can see you.
Oh, okay, you can hear me. Yes.
Yes.
I suppose there's so much. There's something that's called nothing about us without us. This comes from some outfit for the disabled people, South Africa, way back. In other words, I think that the dialogue or the Indaba or the summit, whatever you call it, that we would have even students' voice. If you look at the 2015 cohort, complaining about the 1976 cohort, saying that they are unnoticed and they are unheard, and there's no empathy, it means that the voice of the student itself is missing. It's actually the missing middle, so to speak. And also, if you see the anger that bottles within the students and how they destroy what they need, it speaks to something that compels them to think beyond what makes sense. And so I have so many in my mind, but I don't want to prescribe. I think that we have to try and get a student to a place of being an ethical, respectable, and well-behaved, well-thought-through citizen. And I think that in all the things that we do, if we teach ethics and we teach the peace, we teach all these tenets of how to construct peace within which people's needs can be met, I think that we will be well on our way. So my point is really to call in the students to become part of this, knowing that actually their way is not the only way, but I think that the voice is missing. There's a lot I'm thinking about, Professor Kiet. I don't know when the next chance will be for me to present, or maybe next year or the other year, but I've got views about what kind of a student do I think we need for the country, because certainly that's not the 1976 student. And certainly that's not the student from yesterday. That is a student today who actually doesn't even want this curriculum that we're patching and we're calling it a decolonize. They don't want decolonizing anything. They just want something new and fresh for them. So let me leave it there, Chair.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much. Good timing as well, Nolita, because Nomalanga just re-entered. Noma, let me just check on you quickly. Are you there and are you good to go? And maybe you should not share then anymore?
I think I just live in the wrong part of Humood. So I do need to share, but I think
okay, please share. Please share.
I think I can finish. Yes, if I can find the original thing. Okay, I think. Sorry about that, colleagues.
No, you must don't. No need to apologize.
Holidays, so one can't stay too long at work for the better internet there. I hope you can see it.
We can see. You can continue.
Okay, so I was just pointing out that when the loan schemes were invented, I don't think they could have foreseen education inflation at the rates that it went. But I also think there was a blind spot there in that they were not thinking about what is a post-apartheid society. They were not asking, can you really indebt a population that's been at war for 300 years? They thought it was, I can go into the philosophical questions around thinking about putting loan schemes in place for populations that have literally been ravaged for 3 centuries. So they were not thinking like that, but the post-apartheid government probably had no choice because, of course, they inherited a bankrupt state. So the best way was to assist the Black student or the poor student to get this funding or the missing middle. But of course, the 500,000 became too out of reach for the missing middle, and Roads Must Fall happened, precipitated by the missing middle, not by the who were always protesting, but the ideological battle around the university then began when the middle class realized that they too could no longer afford it. So just to show some numbers, one of the struggles in the higher education sector is that it is designed in a very strange and peculiar way. I don't want to go too deep into the thing, but I think we all know there are sort of 3 different types of universities. Even though the system says we all have different functions, we differentiated, it's clear that that's not really true, because even though I'm at NMMU, I'm still expected to perform at the research level of someone at University of Pretoria if I want to be taken seriously by, for example, the NRF. But if you look at the numbers, you can see here, for example, CPUT, which has 32,000 students, has about 2,800 permanent staff. UCT up the road with 28,000 students, so similar size, has about 4,000 staff members, just almost double. Nelson Mandela University, which has 29,000 students, not too far away from UCT, this is 2020 numbers, has 2,500 or thereabouts permanent staff. I always try to point out to the Rhodes versus University of Venda situation. Rhodes University has 8,000 or thereabouts students and about 1,300 permanent staff. University of Venda has 15,000 students, so double the number, more rural context, but on paper, they have fewer staff members than their equivalent sort of size institution. So in this context, we see that we've had a situation where the inability to foresee that this population that was coming out of being ravaged under apartheid, okay, this would be sort of like if you came out of the Second World War and you just said to Germany, well, everybody just sort of take loans, you know, plan. But here what then happens is we have a situation in which we have no choice but to take the loan scheme systems because the government had been left bankrupt. And so we've seen the incentive system, we've got higher access numbers that lead universities to be able to either charge fees and get the fees, or they can get the government subsidy. But in this context, what's been happening is that there's been a more and more of an erosion of the South African university's ability to sustain itself. This is what we're all living through now. And there are 4 tendencies that I think have emerged in post-apartheid higher education. And that's corporatized education. This is when education is just seen as a corporate sort of commercial venture in which we are all just transformed into almost like company structure, and your job is to service the students, the clients, no matter what they say, no matter what they do. They can scream at you over email, you are at fault as they act. Is a tendency towards greater governmentalism. So this tendency where the university starts to sound more and more like it's a government structure, even the way in which things tend to be addressed, the way in which structures tend to function, the kind of bureaucratization where you think a university might have a little bit more flexibility and dynamism, you see that there's far more and more governmentalization as people try to control the struggles within the university. Our tendency, and I'll just use Stellenbosch as an example, where some universities have just managed to preserve themselves into a bubble. They've got lots of funding, they can pick and choose who they want, they can do a little bit of transformation on the side, but they don't have to worry, and everybody knows it's stable, everybody wants to go there, but everybody also knows that it hasn't quite answered the social call. And then the last tendency, is this mass lecture hall tendency. And this is where the university is just now existing, collect the subsidy, get as many students in. It's tough, there's nothing else that can be done. Research is negligible. Those who do research end up being the ones who basically can just buy themselves out of the problem, and all you do is just churn out. Now, these 4 tendencies, I argue, and this is a conversation that's ongoing amongst myself and many of my peers, is what is leading to a much more intense experience of the disintegration, not just of the university's capability to defend itself within society itself. So we see this letter here, the murder of Prof. Gamwendo. That was myself and my other colleagues who wrote that to the Mail and Guardian around the murder of Prof. Gamwendo, who uncovered a PhD syndicate. Of course, we know because our colleague up the road has had similar problems, and we see this on and on in the sector. Armed men are storming universities, etc. Now, here is what I want to propose we think about. It seems that if you are going to have higher access in the university, so that's greater access, you can either tend towards these more difficult scenarios where you're so under stress and under pressure that you begin to either become more of an ivory tower or more governmentalist, more corporatized, or just more mass sort of teaching. And what that tends to do is it leads to a de-intellectualization of the university, and that leads to a spiral downwards, less attractive to partners. Nobody wants to partner with you. Your talent starts leaving, and a proliferation of corruption within because debate doesn't exist, etc. On the other side, you can have a different kind of scenario where you can have higher access, but in gaining high access and dealing with the fact that there's pressure to increase numbers, you actually drive greater intellectualization of the university. So instead of retreating intellectually, you go forward, far more forward, because that begins to help you to sustain interest in the university. It begins to give a sense of greater trust and patience when times are difficult. And it requires of the leadership, the professoriate, and the administration to maintain high intellectual engagement, not just administrative standards, right? And so part of the thing is that what's happening is that because things are so difficult and people are trying to control and manage the crisis, the greater tendency towards de-intellectualization leads, I think, to far less cohesion in institutions. Thanks, Prof, I've seen you. Far less cohesion in institutions, far more conflict in the institution, which actually leads to even more tendency towards the disintegration, and the leadership then across the board tend to become very defensive, less likely to want to hear, which actually becomes much more destructive for the institution. And those four tendencies I showed tend to proliferate further and further. So I want to just pause there and hope that it gives something to think about and talk about. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks so much, Nomalanga. That last slide has been very, very interesting, of course. We're running slightly late, colleagues, but it is not a train smash. I'm going to manage it just in the following way. I haven't seen anything on the chat that I need to bring into the panel space. So perhaps I'm just going to request the panel members, Joe, Nolita, and Nomalanga, if you may want to, just for 1 minute, of course, just reflect on what you heard your fellow panelists have been arguing and saying, and the propositions that they put forward. Joe, can we start off with you? What's your sense and your reflections on what your other two panelists have been sharing?
Thank you, Andre. Look, I think the first for me is the idea of the idea of peace, that or the university as a place where the production of peace needs to take place is quite an interesting idea that Nolita put forward, and then also the kinds of student that we need at this particular time. And in fact, what is it that the student need from universities? I thought that those, were important ideas. In terms of Nomalanga, I mean, this thing about that, the cost, what the cost is, and I think she was saying it's something like 300,000 for a BA. Now, I was in a seminar yesterday with the public sector, and we had discussed this whole question about cost. As it were, there were people from the NSA there that that is that looks after the NSF, that particular fund, and they were saying that when students ask for bursaries, from business schools in particular, that the amounts of money that's been asked is just extra, just so big. Then I think the last slide, as you pointed out, those four kind of categories, of thinking about where the university is going and so on is is also a useful concept. So thank you very much. I mean, I really enjoyed the presentation.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Joe. Thanks for those observations and reflections. Nolita, please come in and then see how you would like to just connect with both Joe's presentation and that of Nomalanga.
Yes, thank you, Andre. I was engaged very much so on both of my fellow presenters, and I enjoyed their inputs very much. Joe, of course, you know this. The issue of remuneration and equitable remuneration is rather it's actually an issue right now. People may have read the Times Live, was it last week, when this whole issue of remuneration of universities was flagged by the CHE, and how universities land themselves in these kinds of remunerations. And of course, the issue of performance versus remuneration, and all these unequal platforms of remuneration, institution and versus other institutions. And I think I'm actually quite interested in that, because I do know that where I've just been is one of the universities that were flagged for this kind of thing. So I listened to that with interest and actually wondering within myself, what would be the best way? Is it based on the students? I saw Prof. Mkiza was talking about how many students per university and all. It just does not justify the kind of remuneration. So I noted that, Chair. The issues raised, the cost of education raised by Prof. Mkize are actually worrisome. I was at the Department of Education in 1996 when TEFSA was rolling out the student support in terms of finance. And I was there when it turned into now the NSFAS. I do remember that in 2008, when I was in Parliament, the envelope for NSFAS was a mere 2.9 billion. That was 2008. I don't know today how much that is, and that speaks to the ballooning of the costs in terms of education. And I don't know what the government has as a plan for equitable distribution of funds to students. But I note those, Chair, as perennial problems of higher education. And I'm hoping that the next panel will unravel how we can all jointly come to see what we can do as a sector on these questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Nolita, but I can't let you go as yet because Sibongile asked a question on,
What is the question?
you know,
Where's
saying
the
that many of
question?
our students continue to feel marginal to the juggernaut that is the university. How do we organize the university so that it centers the students? Now, that's from our Vice Chancellor. And then, of course, how do we navigate the tension in liberating the student agency while we hold students accountable? So agency vis-a-vis accountability with regard to their preparation for the difficult task that lies ahead. So Nolita, I know that these are actually two big questions. So if you can manage it in 1.5 minutes, well, I will give you an award, okay?
Yeah. Prof. Kiet, I suppose these are the questions themselves are work in progress because there isn't a recipe for success in terms of this. But it does seem to me that the student is misunderstood and the student is hungry for love. Hungry to be heard, hungry to be seen, hungry to be counted, and hungry to participate. And I think that this whole thing of me saying that there is such scarcity of literature around the student or curiosity about what kind of student and what are the needs of the student that we have. And it seems to me that a partnership with the student is actually a way to go. Because if then we're going to sit as management and then just be giving instructions to students, there will forever be pushback in that. And of course, it does talk to the issue that the VC is talking about, that while we do that, while we empathize, while we reach out, while we understand, how do we hold the student responsible as well as accountable? Of course, we're going to talk about consequence management. We're going to talk about all these things. But also the issue for me, and these are the lessons from the COVID-19 where students had to leave universities. And of course, they had to be at home indefinite. And how many students were applying to come back to university because home was no longer a safe place and a peaceful place for students. And therefore, it seems to me that an institution of higher learning is acting more in loco parentis and is more than just an institution, but a home to the students. So the issue is, how does then a university become a home to a student? We can create a vibrant and inclusive learning environment. We can do all these things about interactive curricula. We can do these things about student-centered learning. But of course, the issue is, how does a student become an insider in this whole agenda of higher education? And this is the thing that I'm saying, let's look at it and find out how we can have and co-opt the student as a partner in this agenda. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Nolita. And of course, there's some questions for you in the chat as well, which I can't refer to you now. If we perhaps later on have another chance, you may want to take a bite at them. I'm going to just hand over to Nomalanga now as well. But I also just wanted to check in with Nomalanga. with the question that she raised around the student body being incentivized by academic standards and political and be politically intelligent, and how she then connects that with the intellectualization of the post-apartheid university. So I'm trying to figure out those, Nomalanga, also to make just a connection between those two, whilst you also respond to Joe and Nolita and the comments in the chat box. It's a big ask. Please try and be brief, my friend. Thank you so much.
Sure, I think the others, I'm thinking about them as well, just in terms of remuneration. I think, there's always two drivers. One is the macroeconomic context, but there's also intra-institutional culture. So if the institution cannot find alternate incentives, such as free time, okay, then you will need to compensate your staff according to the market. So you have to find the alternate and equally rewarding mechanisms that can begin to find an equilibrium. But because of the tendencies I was talking about, if people feel alienated from the education vocation, then it will become market related. But we can talk about that. There's more to say about that. I think the issue around students needs a lot of discussion, because it's simultaneous that students feel completely overwhelmed by the university as a structure, but simultaneously they can hold it hostage in unconstructive ways. So both exist at the same time. And the way through that is through fostering greater intellectualization. And I don't really like the word, because you think a university is an intellectual space, but it's clear to me that in the transition away from apartheid, universities became less intellectualized and far more bureaucratized and corporatized. And so you have to find a way for students to feel that the university does what it promises. If the university promises to be an engaging experience for a young person, that's what it should do. And if you set that up as the single most important culture of that institution, if the students can see that my lecturers don't care, they go home at 4 o'clock, why would they buy into the culture? So they would see that, no, my fellow interlocutors, my professors don't take the culture that seriously. So it seems like a very one-dimensional way of saying things, but I think one has proven it over time. I've been at 3 institutions now where the students feel that discourse is real, meaningful, and that the body of the university takes it seriously, and it translates into political gains that assist students. They begin to take the intellectual project far more seriously. Then the politics of the students is not solely about demands. It becomes much more sophisticated. So that's it, because that's what a university is supposed to provide.
Thank you, Norman, and sorry for switching on my video to show the time, but of course we have another panel to move towards. But there's an interesting question by Laura on the chat box. The panelists can have a look at that, all colleagues as well. How the new actors in this space, like big tech companies such as Microsoft, what impact they would have on the sector, and its implications is a very, very crucial question for us. Then Nolita, there's also the comment from Dix around the village metaphor, and Enver also just reminds us, the political economy is about the relationship between the state and the markets. And in the 19th century began to be about capitalism and its critique. What do the panelists think about contemporary capitalism? Please hold that thought, and when we then do the closing remarks after the second panel, the panelists can also then come through this. There's another question for you, Nolita, if you can respond to that in the chat from SJ as well. The tension, being an institution for the social and economic good. Oh, should the tension of higher education being a social and economic good be transferred to a student? Why must the student enter university unable to legally contract and leave a university with a study debt? Who must take responsibility for the cost of education? And then also another one from one of our council members, Councillor Sisulu. Just thank you for the insights and the question around how the university should become a home to students. And Malanga, of course, you're starting then to engage with colleagues like, the VC and Shirley and Tate as well. And then Luzuko, one of our students, are also coming into that particular discussion. So see how you, whilst the second panel is on, can engage with that particular discussion. And now, of course, there's a long string of comments that are coming through in the chat. So many, many thanks for that, colleagues. But we will have to move on to panel 2. Liz, may I ask you to kick us off? And on this panel, we will have Liz, Ahmed, and Luvuyo. And of course, once again, colleagues, their extensive bios have been shared. So I'm not going to read any of those. I'm just going to hand over straight to Liz. We will make up for the time and should be able to close around 6 o'clock or just a few minutes after that. Liz, it's over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Andres. Thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon, everybody. As usual, the topics of these conversations are too difficult for an input of 10 minutes not to take only one part and in a very sort of bitty way. But I mean, let me try and start for first principles while I put my timer so you don't have to shout at me. It is impossible for me, and I've been repeating this for years now, to think about critiques of higher education or the future of higher education without a fundamental critique of the society in which we live. So it is no possibility of transforming higher education or of thinking a future of higher education without a really serious critical view of the capitalist system in which we are operating. And I'm not going to go through the components of a capitalist system in general, but I want to flag a couple of things that are important in our time. The issue of technology has revolutionized the concept of commodity. It has revolutionized the context of what it means by data and information, etc. The fact that we are talking about logarithm capitalism or that we are talking about informational or surveillance capitalism is something that it is important. The fact that this happened does not mean that the more traditional forms of capitalism do not exist. In order to sustain the data economy and the high-tech companies and the high consumer, etc., we need to have people who are prepared to reproduce the workers, because people need to be fed, people need to be clothed, etc. We see these things in particularly acute ways in low-income and intermediate income countries, but I mean, this happens all over the world. Our institutions function in that context. And it's that political economy that ends up defining the political economy of higher education. So there is no way of saying we are going to change the political economy of higher education without tackling the big issues. The problem is that every time that we talk about sustainability in terms of the higher education system, we are thinking of sustainability within the system that there is. So we want more funding, and I agree with that we want more funding, but we're going to go into that just now. And we want to find ways in which we can generate the funding that the government does not give us. So every time that we think about that, what do? We say, oh, how many courses can we put online? And we enter into this madness of selling Again, our knowledge and our services via companies that are making an extra profit from that. So I think that Laura is in amongst the audience, and the argument about the platformization of higher education is a fundamental thing that we are not seeing and we are not dealing with. On the contrary, we are walking all in a one straight line, doing that thing, competing, moreover, with each other for this, and define our own principles about openness, democratization, and access. So that's one set of issues that for me is really, really important, and that contextually we do not deal with. We refuse to deal with it. In the same way that we are scared of pulling out of rankings because we are not going to get the money, or we were scared, we are still scared in some parts of the world, about saying no to the genocide in Palestine because then we are not going to be funded by the Jewish funders. So all those things are our political responsibility. Now, in terms of the realities of our country, and going into the issue of funding that Numalanga put absolutely correctly on the table, we have a funding system in higher education, and I'm not talking about NSFAS, I'm talking about the funding, I'm talking about the subsidy that comes to the institutions, which is ridiculous and completely inadequate, to what we do. These things do not fund the things that we offer to students. All the social services, all the social infrastructure that universities put on the table for students are not really funded by the subsidy. Moreover, from an epistemological point of view, the subsidy is organized in an intersection between subject matters and how long does a degree take. The subject matters that organize the subsidy in higher education prevent any form of development of multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, creation of new programs that are outside that subsidy. Why? Because inside our universities, the modes of funding allocation are done along the lines of department, faculties, etc., who compete with each other for the size of the cake. This is reproduced and multiplied by the second element of the regulatory system in South African higher education, which is, of course, the quality assurance system, for which some of us are particularly guilty. And that provides exactly the same logic. So when you said in one of your questions, are we producing the graduates, and Nambita correctly thinks in terms of what are the graduate attributes? Well, the types of knowledge that we are offering are not responding to the needs of the critique that we need to effect, neither are responding to a preparation of the students to engage the society in which they are going to live. So I always think that the famous phrase of Dr. King about the arch of justice, I think that capitalism has proven sufficiently that the arch of its development does not go into that, does not bend towards justice, but bends towards inequality. So what is the mission that we have? To prepare students who are able to change their way of being in the world, of all society, and that is what we need to construct together with them. So I really would like, and that, would imply a fundamental change in the manner in which we govern and we organize higher education institutions. Our relationship with society will have to change. Our relationship with the state will have to change. Our relationship with our students will have to change. Who our advisors in the many advisory boards that faculties have will have to change. The things that we teach will have to change. How do we relate with the government when it comes to land, energy, women? You know, there are all sorts of things that we do following the path that have been sort of demarcated for us, and we are always scared of taking a step out of that. There are endless examples of this. We could have marched with the students to the union buildings. We didn't, because we were too scared of defying the state ourselves. And so it goes. So for me, there is no critique of higher education independently from a critique of the political economy within which higher education institutions function. And that has to be done at every single level of the university. What we teach, what we research, what do we understand for community engagement and social presence, etc. And in our particular case, what does it mean to be African universities? So 10 minutes is the most oxygen that my lungs allow me. So that's all for me. Thank you.
No, thank you, Comrade. That was wonderful, Liz. Thank you so much for that presentation. And I hope, you know, the discussions in the chats will go on, and then later on also give you some space and time to reflect, you know, back into this particular group as well. So, colleagues, wonderful. I hope you're still enjoying it. Let me move straight on to Ahmed. Ahmed, please start off with your... Oh, and thank you so much, Ahmed, for joining us.
No problem. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and hello, everybody. It's very nice to be on this program and to participate in this what is really a really interesting set of discussions. And it's not very often that one sort of sits in a meeting and sort of agrees with most of what's being said. So thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I just want to begin, you know, by saying that, you know, if we consider what, you know, what we saw during the student uprisings 2015, 2017, you know, what we really did see was this a slap, you know, a slap in the face that we got about the collapse of kind of a social compact that was put together in 1994. And in some ways, you know, 30 years on, it's a really good time, at least for us to sit down and do and to think again. And in some respects, you know, when I look back, it seems like, you know, the higher education system has been treading water like during this time, you know, during the 30 years. Of course, you know, there have been lots of changes, not all of it positive, of course. But at the same time, I mean, one has this feeling that the system hasn't changed. You know, it's just like sort of carried on, if you like, you know, in a kind of, it's almost like we are sort of, you know, in treacle, you know, kind of, and it's all about what Liz has just said, which is, it's about the fact that, you know, you can't contemplate a higher education system outside of the political economy in which it is embedded. And if that hasn't changed, then, you know, you can't expect the higher education system to have changed very much. In fact, I would argue that we've gone backwards in very many ways. And I'll, you know, in the 10 minutes I've got, I'll just try and kind of pick up a couple of those points. The interesting thing for me, I think, you know, an interesting lens, at least, for us to begin to think about these things is that, you know, there are three major forces, at least there are many forces, but three major forces that that are brought to bear on higher education. The first clearly is this idea of politicization. Just the idea that actually universities are in the political terrain, they are pulled in one direction to the other. And, you know, I always say like that higher education in South Africa has been trapped in a cauldron of imaginations, you know. We went from the RDP to the RDP white paper to GEAR to ASGISA, GIPSA, the African Renaissance. And each time universities were sort of dragged in one direction or the other. And that's just a very good example of how universities are trapped, in fact, in the political economy. The second big area of influence is the issue of democratization. the fact that, you know, universities used to be much more elite now than they are. They used to be much more elite than they are now. Student numbers between 1994 and now have sort of doubled, more than doubled, in fact, almost tripled, in fact. And what that tells you, in fact, is that that democratization is not coming purely from a public good point of view. It's coming from kind of the impetus of the political economy again on the higher education system. You know, what does the labor market need, et cetera, et cetera. So now I'm not suggesting that democratization of higher education is not a good point, not a good thing to engage in, but I think we have to look at it in the context with which it came into being in South Africa. And then thirdly, you know, an influence that received a lot of acceleration since 2015 is the whole issue around decolonization, however we kind of define it and however we think about it. So, you know, so those three give us a kind of lens, if you like, to think about this period of time. You know, in reflecting on things, I mean, there's one thing that I sort of come to sort of realize. Actually, I'm not even sure if I'm totally correct about it. So I know that Enver, for example, is in the audience, and I'd like to hear, you know, his thoughts on this. But one of the things that occurred to me is that in the thinking leading up to 1994, the discourse was really mainly about what does higher education have to offer society. You know, we wanted to move from away from an extraction economy to a knowledge economy. You know, what would universities, what would higher education contribute to that? We needed to move from a predominantly white system to a black system, to a democratic system. You know, what would higher education offer for that? How would higher education correct the imbalances in our system? The third, you know, then a third example would be the strengthening of democracy. What would universities contribute to the strengthening of democracy? Yeah, so one gets a sense that there was a very powerful set of influences that shaped higher education, shaped the way in which we were thinking about higher education, at least. Excuse me. As we moved into the policy process in 1994, 95, 96, things changed, because all of a sudden it was all about what universities could offer society. It was, you know, the kinds of research universities could do. It was about addressing the race and gender imbalances, but you know, that's what universities would contribute to society, if you like. The third example would be, ensuring that that universities were much more efficient and effective. It's nothing per se wrong with that, but the discourse changed from what universities could offer society to what, at least from what society wanted from universities to what universities could offer societies, if you like. And interestingly, of course, it's that policy process that gave rise to the Higher Education Act. And of course, as GEAR kicked in, the one thing that became completely clear was this idea that there wasn't going to be a lot of funding, etc. Now, one might say, well, actually, South Africa was a resource-constrained society. We shouldn't have expected more funding and so on. The problem is what Liz and Nomalanga and others have said already, which is that if you produce a university system that's resource-constrained, what it does is it forces the system then to adopt approaches that basically corporatizes higher education, that really kind of forces the universities to enter the market. And of course, you know, the fact that universities are embedded in a political economy is emphasized by that particular detail. It's that detail that really drags the universities into that political economy. of course, the fact that universities are knowledge-intensive, social institutions, means that they are also then, they also subscribe, if you like, not just subscribe, but they also buy into the global political economy. So the whole issue around globalization then kicks in, and universities are genuinely sort of, enthusiastic about globalization and all of its sort of instruments, if you like. And by that, I mean, the rankings and so on and so forth. Just the whole WTO GATS system and so on. We really agonized about the GATS system, but eventually we signed up to it. So it's just this idea that that not only are universities a part of the national political economy, but they're also kind of embedded in the global political economy. And what I want to just conclude by saying, is very much to kind of go to the point that was raised both by Nolita and by Nomalanga, which is to say that there is a need for us to really revisit the kind of the purpose of universities, placing students at the center, focusing on the experience of students. That would then take us back to the purpose of universities, to take us away from the corporatization and so on. So for me at least, the real big question is, in the context that we have, this limited funding which drives this kind of corporatization, is it possible for universities like ours to begin to address these issues of these issues of student-centered, being student-centered, being much more committed to the public good and so on? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. I remember your framing of student-centeredness in the use of space so many years ago already, and I'm glad that that is a recurring theme coming through, because it's our work that needs to continue. So many thanks for that reminder. Luvuyo, please let's move to you now, and then afterwards I will just go through the chats and see how the panelists would like to respond to those. In the meantime, both Ahmed and Nis, please check out the chats that refers to your presentation. Thank you so much. Mr. Masana? I saw Mr. Masana in the room earlier. Samira, can you just double check for us on that, please?
Sure thing, President Director.
Yeah. Oh, I see here's Mr. Masana calling. Colleagues, I have to take this call quickly.
I see I'm unmuted, but my video is not coming out, but it's fine.
Okay, Mr. Masana, if you then can continue without your video. Those ask you to start your video.
All right, that's thanks a lot. I hope I am audible. And
no, we can hear you very well, Mr. Masana. Please continue.
Thank you. Let me start by saying I think I had a similar experience like I think Nolita earlier on, the other presenter who made an appreciation that, with the new developments and the different, permutations that are coming out right through the country, right through the globe, just in the recent days and in the very recent hours, it was difficult to stick to what one had opted for. But the topic that one opted for in this seminar on the choice of the 6 areas is number 5. And I may say that after the discussions that have taken place right now, one has opted to rather focus on 3 areas than to talk to all of the areas that I would have spoken to, because they have been fairly covered. And I must say that on these 3 areas are probably might be expanding to a couple of other points in them. The first one is the university needs to understand and appropriately locate itself, firstly, in the entire higher education ecosystem. And we need to be able to appreciate the various important layers and levels of that ecosystem. That's the first area that I will touch on. The second area that I will touch on is on the need to appreciate the past, experiences of society, engage with the present with that appreciation of where we come from, but also build the futures with an appreciation of not delinking the past from the present, but linking those two so that we are purposeful of what we are seeking to address and build into the future, and not to repeat what could have happened, which was bad from the past. And the last area would be on linking with the previous point on how we engage in the nation building project. And the nation building project, I will also be talking to it in much more, bigger than just or broader than just the one facet of it, but the different components that we need to be considering. I think the first thing, just on the ecosystem, we must appreciate and understand that the type of dysfunctionalities in the entire education system, from your general band education system to the higher education system, are actually intertwined, and they actually present to us a challenge of a continuing dysfunctionality, because the actual access and throughputs that we have are a reflection of what we have in the general band of the education system. And they are also a reflection of how South Africa has been structured in itself in the past, with regard particularly to the fact that you have under-resourced, Bantustan areas or under-resourced rural areas, and which also was an indication of a challenge that then provides, universities with students and learners that need to be bridged into a university system. And our university system, is it really able to successfully provide that bridging mechanism, and then therefore be able to produce the quality of graduates that we want out of the system? But also the other thing is the development agenda of the country. Are we responsive to that? And are we actually, before being responsive, are we informing the substance and the content as the thought leadership in society of the actual development agenda of the country? And which, for me, I think it's something that we need to be critiquing quite very strongly. And of course, a lot has been said about the apartheid era higher education system, and I wouldn't go to that historical line. But just to say that I'm sure all of us would know the resourcing system, which has been spoken about already, is telling of what development agenda that was pursued, and how therefore higher education played the role. And you can see that perpetuation of the current resourcing levels and between the different universities in the country continues, without, a major, impact and change on it. And I'm arguing that one of the things that we need to be, fairly attuned to is that we cannot talk about being embedded in society without also in the broader, sector addressing these realities. But however, as a university, I think we need to be doing a couple of things in respect of appreciating what our past is, and but also dealing with building, the future. The reality of what we have confronted is that we have a society that has been made to believe in itself, particularly the African communities, as not being capable and able, and as not being productive and progressive. And this is part of what the colonial system, at the center of it, worked to, ensure that when the real assimilation occurs, we actually become commodified human beings ourselves, and we are out of the intellectual rigor and understanding of how development is. So universities have to play a role, and I think the argument on decolonizing higher education and universities is exactly about that thought liberating discovery that we need as universities, and we need to put within our curricula. And I'm not talking just in terms of curricula as in respect of just the history and understanding of history, but I'm talking also the science. Because if you understand the civilization and what has been arrested of the development of Africa and the civilization of Africa by colonial dispensations, you need then to be able to understand that it is out of that, just before you come to the resource endowments that are latent in Africa, you need to be understanding that the purpose of civilization in the extraction of those resources was also to destroy the development path and civilization of Africa. So we need to also go back and understand exactly that particular science and history that is embedded. So therefore, a university has to ensure and assure deliberate programs of unlearning these dominant, colonial patterns of thought and imperial patterns of thought, and relearning and unthinking and rethinking them in a manner that develops then a student who is intertwined to society in understanding the social dynamics and economic dynamics of society, and be able to contribute in the development of that society. And that takes me to the topic of nation building. And I do want to say that the nation building project should be understood in all of its different facets: your political, your social, your economic, your environmental, your cultural and technological in the recent days. But for that to happen, there are certain values that need to be imbued in the public consciousness. I see that you're giving me a notice. And those values include, amongst others, values of egalitarianism, values of collectivism, and again, universities must play the role of imbuing to leadership thought liberation and critical consciousness, because amongst others, leaders we have need to be able to know what they are leading and for what purpose and toward what end game are they leading. And again, lastly, the university itself in its internationalization program has to be very deliberate about cultural diplomacy. And in a sense, then exchanges must also get into the space of what sort of cultures are we seeking, to build with who amongst our friends. And the very last point I would want to make is that in these current periods now, in our days, just currently as we're talking, these uncertainties about the type of government to have, the type of discontinuities and complexities that they will bring, they are going to require nimble-mindedness and nimble-footedness from within higher education to help inform, the political leaders through thought leadership in placing the right decisions, and as well as developing the right models to take the transformation agenda forward. And it is going to be that evidence-based knowledge that will anchor them to understand that the indices of development are telling us where the problems are, and therefore we need to be responsive in the country to those indices. And it is higher education that must support and help that work. Thanks a lot. My apologies if I went over.
No worries, Luvuyo. Thank you so much for that. A thoughtful intervention and contribution. Highly appreciated, Luvuyo, Ahmed, and Liz. So, colleagues, let's kick off in this way because I do see some of the engagement in the chat. So I'm going to ask Liz, you probably have had a look at the comments both from Muki and from Enver. And so I'm going to give you a chance to come back and then also perhaps respond to Ahmed's presentation or just some reflections on that and that of Luvuyo as well. But also keep an eye on those comments that were directed at your presentation. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you there, and thank you very much for the questions. I answered to Comrade Motala already, but I mean, let me say more directly. I think that the project of the University of the Left, to which you made reference, Ember, is a bankrupt project. The University of the Left does only exist as a mythology in which one harks back to things that have ceased to exist, assuming that they existed at some point. So that's my response to that. What I think we need to do is to be brave to start creating experiments of different type of social relationships between the university and the different sectors it should serve. My sense is that as the things are here and in the world, it is going to be very difficult to find any state that would be happy to carry along a project such as the one that I'm proposing. But I keep on saying that if the 10 top universities in the rankings, for example, decided collectively to pull out of the rankings and to present something different, that would create the crack. That's not going to happen. So what can universities like Nelson Mandela University, like any university for that matter, do in order to change these relationships? And these things would go into the direction of what Novalanka was saying. How do we create universities in which the system is not an alienating system for the students? How we make a space that is actually over-bureaucratized, over-complex, and rules-bound to the point of nonsense, start speaking to other things. So that's one of the issues. What I mentioned about the SESM categories is that Muki referred to in the chat is very real. I mean, and I have these problems at the university where I work, that we cannot change things because the faculties are horrified at the possibility of losing subsidy. So that's the other thing. And I mean, Albert is completely correct about the history with which we came to this. But I mean, I think that the reality is that in 1990, when the government of today, well, actually of yesterday, it was preparing to govern, the notion was not about a re-engagement with the capitalist economy. The engagement was about the racial elements of capitalism. They were not engaging with racial capitalism in the way in which Alexander would have done. So I just think that we live, we are a consequence of our history. The models that we look for were not the models that were going to allow us to bring up a different type of democracy. Neither was the political and economic choices that we made maybe not so much in 1994, but certainly post the first ANC government. And so we have gone, adding things to the system, making complex decisions, adding more things that we need to take care about, which are correct. But again, without thinking carefully about the basis for the system. So I really think that in whichever order one wants to do it, from the sublime to the ridiculous or from the ridiculous to the sublime, the university needs to be disestablished and refounded on different parameters. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Liz. Ahmed, would you like to come in here briefly and then
Yeah,
so that we can... Yeah, please.
Just 2 points. I mean, the first point I'd like to make is that universities are complex, right? I mean, there's spaces within university, they're diverse. You know, they have a whole range of different kind of what can one call it? Sort of, it's a sociology that goes on in universities. So the one thing I think we have to exploit is this idea that universities can be sites of ideological battle, you know, that they should be sites of ideological battle. And that's, you know, that's not just about the fact that we can have those debates, but it's also about, you know, capturing the imagination of people who are at the university with new visions, at least, and so on. So that's the one thought I had, you know, that we have to think of universities as being sites of battle, if you like. The second point I'd like to make is that I think that there's a need, that there is the potential for us to revisit the notion of engagement. I don't mean community engagement. I mean the engagement between universities and society. With the idea that the issue of engagement should really be an opportunity for the revisioning of the knowledge project of universities. Now, of course, that brings us back to Liz's point, which I fully agree with, which is that you can't really think of universities outside of the political economy in which they are operating. But on the other hand, engagement will also be a very powerful way of reshaping the social ownership of universities. And I think that could be a very powerful force as we go into the future. So I'll just make those 2 points and stop there. Thanks.
I know. Thank you so much for that, Ahmed. Very, very thoughtful interventions there as well. Luvuyo, please, and then I will move towards closure, colleagues. Thank you so much.
A lot is happening with my systems here, Andre. If you can just highlight what the question is on the chat box, because I can't access
No,
it.
I was just thinking whether you wouldn't want to just interface with your 2 co-panelists in terms of what you have heard. Just 1 or 2 points, Luvuyo.
No, thanks. No, I think I agree quite a lot with both Ahmed as well as Liz, because the real point that he closes with is that these are in themselves sites of transformation engagements, and in that character, therefore, you would not be seeing them as immune of the bigger contradictions that are taking place in the broader political economy. So some would say there is equally a political economy of each individual institution, which you need to be able to understand and be able to have the different forces, particularly those of transformation, and I use that word as generally forces of progress, must be able to always understand at all times. And in this instance, I think by the visions and the missions that universities do, because that's where the first sight of those struggles take place, by the visions and missions that they develop, they then start to ascertain as to what sort of direction are they going to be pursuing as progressive institutions, and including in their contribution within the broader progressive transformation of society. So I think that's where we should invest, quite a lot of energy as well, is dealing with the North Star of ourselves and being clear about what we're seeking to achieve.
Thanks, Luvuyo. Thanks so much. Liz, there's a final question from Luzuko there for you. If you just want to take that quickly for 30 seconds.
Sorry, I didn't see the question. Repeat it to me.
Luzuko says that university is microcosm of society, and he said he always finds it a bit too defeatist because we cannot do much about capitalism unless it is destructed, you know. So more or less asking, you know, what kind of things are possible within this big challenge that we're facing?
I think that a whole lot of things are possible, and of course it is about destruction. It is about creative destruction, but destruction nevertheless. Let's just take the example of any curriculum. Let's take the example of engineering, for example. What will happen if a university starts looking at the curriculum of engineering from a different point of view? Right now, most of the subjects taught in engineering are technical subjects. There is very little in terms of what housing means, what housing or water or chemistry or whatever you want to imagine. What are the social impact of those things? What does thinking in terms of engineering from a social justice point of view? What are the languages that an engineer needs to manage in order to deal with communities? What do we do in terms of land, etc., etc.? What do we do in terms of ecologies? All of those things are completely outside most of the formal curricula are accepted by the council for engineering, and you cannot get that because you go over credit. That's a stupid thing, for example. Small, it seems, but I mean, that cannot be done. So there are small things that we can do, and there are different relationships that we can establish with people. That would mean undermining the power of EXA, the power of the advisory boards that function at most faculties of engineering, and including the people you are working with in the definition of the problems. That's a small thing by comparison. Of course, I'm defeatist because that's where we are 30 years hence. But I still believe that it is we can still kick and try and do things differently. That was just as a matter of example.
Well, thanks so much, Liz. And Councillor Sisulu, I also note your point that you made around the importance of indigenous languages, which is very crucial. And I know that Enver is also making the point about small and big things, which he also discussed at the workshop last week. So thank you very much for this, colleagues. Now, our first webinar, Chair, you may agree, has gone very well. And of course, it touched on so many of the 6 framing points that you made earlier in locating this webinar. And of course, this now simply sharpens our mind as to how more targeted we can become as we put forward the different themes for discussions moving forward. And they are big questions. They are like the questions of our time as far as our sector is concerned. And I don't think that any form of governance or governing structure would be able to escape those in years to come. So we are very grateful for Council taking this initiative in making the space for these matters to be on the table. It is certainly a watershed movement as far as our university is concerned. So the various elements of thought that came through, also the different sets of themes that emerge, range from both the funding and financing of universities, both in the context of inequalities and, of course, remunerative regimes, up to the function of the university and the metaphorical angling of the university in the image of the village and the Malanga, referring to the blind spots. But key, of course, the question about how the intellectualization or the intellectual culture of a university can be so defining for what the university is. Let's lock the system into its structural constraints, rightfully so, to argue for this particular hard work that's required and the difficult thinking that needs to emerge. And of course, both the question of technology was loitering more or less in the background, both in the chats and of course, in the talks by the panelists as well. And the big questions coming through that is especially the notion of the platformization of education, where one has to keep a critical eye on those, and of course, folding that into the funding system as well. Ahmed made the crucial 3 points around politicization, democratization, and decolonization in respect of the university, and of course also came back with regard to the ownership of the university that can be reconfigured by a better and more productive and imaginative notion of engagement towards the end as well. And of course, Luvuyo also makes this very, very crucial point about the university being located in a broader ecosystem, but also in a broader temporal, location as far as both its past and its present and its future is concerned, and the broader developmental and of course nation building responsibilities that the university have, also within the notion of the different types of knowledges that needs to emerge for the university to take up these particular difficult challenges and balances that it needs to perform within society in general. So colleagues, of course, that is a very, very, what I would call a flimsy summary of what I've heard. Promise that the report will look much better. And then just to say that this is just the opening of this particular series, and many, many thanks. Your thought processes have provided so much sharpening moves as we move ahead with this series. I'm going to hand over now to our Deputy Chair, Ms. Michelle Mbako, just to do a vote of thanks. And, from my side, of course, also just thanks for all of you for attending. Deputy Chair?
Thank you, Prof. Kiet. Good evening, colleagues. I think the timing of tonight's program is very important. Many of us, I'm sure, will agree that after 30 years of democracy and where we find ourselves tonight as a country, waiting to see what will unfold tomorrow and beyond, this opportunity for us to really reflect on the environment where we find ourselves in higher education is an important one, in my view, also for us to focus on the issues as particularly as governors of the university, how to proceed without hopefully being overwhelmed by what could potentially divert us of what it is that we've committed to as governors. So mine is to thank everyone, and thank you, Prof. Kiet, for your summary of what we were engaging on, but also in terms of driving tonight's process. I'm sure it was a difficult one, and thank you for the timekeeping, because the issues that were raised is so important. And we always find time as a constraint for us to fully engage. But I think what tonight also presents for us as members of council in terms of how we look at some of the issues, and thank you for the diversion views that were raised tonight by our panelists, thank you very much, will also help us and provide some context and reflection for all of us. But let me also just proceed and thank our council of the university on behalf of the council to basically express our gratitude, first and foremost, to our chairperson of council, Ambassador January Badil, for really providing the context and for your opening remarks, and as Andre reflected, in terms of framing tonight's discussion. We would also like to thank the Vice-Chancellor for her role in ensuring that the council decision to engage with a broad section of the university community and beyond becomes a reality. I think one of the issues, Prof. Kiet, going forward is the issue that has been raised and also raised by the chair in the chat, is maybe the absence of a student voice on the panel, and I'm sure it's something that will be addressed going forward. Thank you to our panelists for availing yourselves for your role in ensuring that the seminar is engaging, and indeed it was engaging. And a special note of thanks to Dr. Bawa, who's a friend of this university, and also thank you for availing yourself and for your time and joining us in this discussion tonight. I would like also to a note of thanks to our organizing team at Krishet, led by Prof. Kiet, and the officers of the Vice-Chancellor and the Registrar. And then to everyone who attended the first installments of the seminar series for 2024, we'd like to say thank you very much. Nkosi, Ayadanki, have a wonderful evening. Thank you.